I'm very pleased to welcome you to what is the last of what's been a wonderful year of lectures in the Women's Studies and Religion program. We are delighted to have Research Associate Nimachia Hernandez speaking today. And before I introduce Nimachia and her talk, Marcus Briggs-Cloud is going to offer an honor song in honor of this occasion. Marcus.
And Kanvarski Ola doers when Cheski Malegra who dog Algidos woman it's a Voja Malegra who swell Gido much when Kanvarski na de Eden doers and when Hayumat Yadat Magazago at Idos woman who know of man Hazalat Kofatsamun Hazozavat Yada woman Istiana Jumi when Tijari Julagidadi in Fulada woods it is moment Hayumat Hobidagi that Stijari Mahagar Gitagi got full of windows and Hayumat Mahayadat Stijari Mahaga Sugin Iazidin does and so Imatako and Tayajit when Yegan is tea. My name is Marcus Briggs-Cloud. I'm a Miccosukee person from the Muskogee Nation and a son of the Wind Clan people and a grandson of the Bird Clan people. And just wanted to acknowledge the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples whose land that we're on at this time and thank them for allowing us to meet in their homeland for this occasion. And I want to sing this honor song for Nimachia Hernandez from Browning from the Blackfeet people. And she's been a great influence on our small Native population here at the Divinity School, but it's been a good resource for us, and we appreciate that both emotionally and intellectually, and providing the opportunity for us to feel a sense of comfort in her presence, to confide in about issues that we struggle with as Indigenous peoples in academia. So I'm going to lead into a song that was sung when my people, the Muskogee people, were displaced from our traditional homelands in what's known today as Alabama and Georgia into Indian Territory, what became in 1906 Oklahoma, known to many folks by that name. But it's a song of perseverance that we were removed in the winter time. So I'm going to offer that song for Nimachia, and because she is a Native woman, dignified Native woman who's completed, her PhD and still maintains a desire to produce scholarship in this world and be a warrior for Indigenous peoples all over the world. So at this time, I'd just like to ask you to stand in honor of that. Madotsigage, Riagadi to Wagachaste. Oh.
Thank you, Marcus, for helping us to honor Nimachia today, and also thank you for your own efforts to combine the path of Indigenous knowledge and the path of academic learning. Nimachia has been an exemplar in this, and I'm happy to be able to tell you a little bit about her background. She began her education at Princeton, continued with work in linguistics, and then did her doctorate at the Harvard School of Education, where she worked on Blackfoot philosophy in her doctoral dissertation, which became the basis for her first book, which is currently in press, soon to be published, Makasini, Blackfoot Philosophy. She's now working on her what will be her second book-length project, in the work that she's going to present to us today. She brings a very unusual voice, bringing her academic background together with a commitment to Indigenous knowledge systems and language. And there are very few people who can offer us this kind of combination of knowledge. So I'm very pleased to welcome Nimachia to the podium.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all of you coming out to hear this talk, and for the esteemed company, and for the beautiful welcome. And why is my brother pointing a camera at me? That's embarrassing. Okay, so thank you as well for being here, Manuel. Today, I wanted to talk a little bit about this double entendre with my title for the talk today, which I've called From Sacred to Servant, the conversion of the Indigenous woman in the West. For several reasons, I've decided that I wanted to talk both about the ways in which the sacredness of servants' positions, as well as what happens when the history of the traditional role has been pushed aside and miscommunicated, and in many cases misconstrued to be something, if present, then almost like that of a witch, the way that it's been described in many cases in the readings I've been doing on the colonization of the Western frontier. This presentation represents a small portion of a larger project called Native American Women on the Western Frontier, Changing Roles and Maintaining Traditions, a work in progress focusing on images of and responses from Native elders about this same dynamic. The relationship between gender, land, and women's roles in religious societies on the plains in pre-colonial and in present times. The larger project is a result of several years of research for actually my previous project, during which time I noticed several important themes that I felt should be discussed. A few of which I'll recap for you today, and that I'll mention now as sort of 4 or 5 different main points. One of the themes is the anonymity, which is the silencing sort of that comes from not being included, or from maybe not just having researchers, explorers, or religious personnel who were visiting the West think it important to speak to the women or to list their participation. As part of the enterprise of the exploration, also the dominion over land plays a big part in why the women's voice was not part of it insofar as religious or political aspects were concerned. And I think part of that's intentional, because the need for the labor that was part of the settling of the frontier was in part, in many cases, due to women's work. There's also general confusion as to how to regard the Native woman, noticing that women are simultaneously regarded as sacred by members of their communities, and yet as some of the first writers of the West defined chastity, these women were definitely not in the category of either virginity or marriage to a single husband, which raised a lot of complex questions for those just meeting them, saying, well, how can they be considered sacred if they're not either of those two things? Also, there's general misunderstandings about the Native roles within her society, meaning issues of property, labor, and ownership of anything, really, even children, gens, you name it. Women's domestic work is understood by outsiders to represent her social role as a drudge, as chattel, slave, and the like by her own people. The next two are the necessity of women sort of needed to produce the food, the clothing, medicine, and healing, often sex and children, maybe just for those needs, and also for maintaining closer, peaceful relations with political and religious aspects of their new life. And the last one was this idea of the religious conversion and why that would become necessary as a part of the settling of the frontier. In his works, I'm just going to I've realized for weeks I have too many images. So what I've decided is I'm going to make it a movie while I speak. Because some of these images are just to give you an impression. I realize that whenever you talk about anything like this, it's necessary to give the historical, which is a little bit difficult to do without sort of a visual context. So these are just some images of the initial contacts, which were not really with clergy or politicians, but rather with traders who would come in and explorers who would come by and try to identify the appropriate descriptor for the women and what they were doing and how they were, whether they were hauling teepees or dogs or making all of the food. And I think it was seen as, it was definitely seen as the drudge work while the men strode about on their horses with their beautiful headdresses and carried their spears and took fancy pictures with paint all over their face and things like that. I mean, they would pose for artists because artists, say from Germany, would come over and say, well, this is very striking. I'd really like to see this. And I have only selected a few quotes that you can kind of read as we go. But there was a real priority to description, right? These are new people we're meeting. We're identifying them as such. So are they tall? Do they have long hair? Do they have dark skin? What color is their dark skin? There was a lot of attention put towards those types of things. And as well, attention to describing the men as often more attractive than the females because they were dressed up, whatever. And so that they struck a better pose. So in the trading, it was often this idea of, well, when the women come in to do their work, they'd bring in the Matthew Cocking, who was one of the first explorers. You had Charles Lapenteur, and you had Duncan McGillivray, people up in the Canadian border as well, who were border regions to the sort of frontier west here, who also defined these, they noticed that they would bring in materials to trade and had aspects of clothing and things like that because they had actually done the work. So one of the first things that was noticed is they barter for themselves. In other words, they provide the goods and they come and get the needles or the beads or whatever it is that they want. And they buy themselves blankets and pretty much that's the same way that ties are still done. Wait, let me use mine right here. So now, sometimes big safety pins instead. Well, and then with the coming of sort of the introduction of the larger trade as the fur trade took off, a lot of the alcohol, the diseases, the other things that were sort of affecting. Now, this is kind of a long-winded way to get to it, but to sort of show how in the historical record it has been documented that, in fact, these women played a great part in the sustenance of the settlement and the exploration. They provided food for the trades, and they also did provide a livelihood. I mean, the men who were hired for the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, were specifically chosen because they were young and unmarried, and that way they wouldn't have to haul their whole families, and they wouldn't have to come out and burden the companies with their additional family members. Only problem is then they adopted or took in or had, 10 children by 2 or 3 wives, and would end up having a collection of additional people who would live within those confines of the fort in order to do that. Also, there's another problem, which is that in the reports, it's often, and I just tried to find one small example so I wouldn't burden you, because with the several hundred pages of Lewis and Clark, you could find many. But the reliance upon women as guides, as mediators, as communicators, because of course Sacagawea spoke her own language and sign language, which is pretty much the way that Lewis and Clark got around. But here was one example where the voice of Meriwether Lewis is sort of talking about how at this place I met with a plant. Well, often in his journals he'll write that type of language where sort of like the plant walked up and said hello or something, But in Clark's, less sophisticated honesty, he would say things like, at this place the squaw collected a parcel of roots of which the Shoshone eat. And so then later on you see how they were collecting, and at the time, well, if I could learn how to. Right here, where you say, at this time the species was unknown to science, and then, of course, 2 days after this, it was June 25th, on 2 days later, then, of course, Lewis went back and collected them. But as an example of sort of the ways in which the teachings and the very sophisticated botanical and herbal knowledge that these women knew was kind of just put aside, and, and this is a collection of some of these that you can, courtesy of the Peabody, you can go check out. But these are the actual, some of the foods that they brought over, the patties and the turnips, potatoes, and in particular the pemmican patty up here, and the camas and other bulbs and things like that. And then the other part was, the marriage with many members of the native communities, because in a sense, if you married a chief's wife, it meant that you were secure in more or less a temporary sometimes very long-term marriages. This is Culbertson, who married into the Blackfeet, which is he was a very important person, because he managed to forge a relationship where, as the natives put it, they just put up with him because he was married into the family. But by that, he was showing and demonstrating a willingness to work toward maybe the goals of the people, or at least not outright harm. And this was just an example of the ways in which his wife held on to the traditional medicinal practices of her people's ways. And so when her children were sick, or their children rather were sick, she would try to heal them, and they would, like it says here, end up getting booted out. So this is my take on Married to the Mob, but this is Married to the Trade. But this was also another part of this aspect of the children who were then born of these couplings would often end up working for the posts, or as translators and interpreters and guides to those who came later. But again, they were the ones, because of their sort of marginal status sometimes, they did speak both languages, maybe neither one of them very well sometimes. Mostly the native language was the stronger one. So again, George Catlin and others, where they sort of, I just like this one because they were talking about the, what it actually took to try to communicate with and contact and describe. It must have been really overwhelming for people coming from such a different way of seeing things. And the ways in which a lot of the descriptors in some of the first explorers' work, it describes it as sort of they'd be happy with a handful of beads. Going back to this idea of the trinket association of, and in fact they do use that word many times. They'll say, well, if you give this woman a handful of trinkets, she'll be happy and go away. And so in that sense, sort of, again, sliding the role a little bit, And then there are several accounts of RCMP officers who make jokes about how they're on wife number 36 now because they were able to buy them for a drink and a handful of beads. And in that sense, it's very hard, I think, to go back and wonder, well, how could you take this seriously and do scholarship about these women's role when a lot of the literature actually looks like this. I couldn't figure out I still don't know whether he's married her 57 times or whether that's his number 57, because some of the other guys very proudly wrote about how they had number 30-something or whatever. So, of course, as land, opens up, and I'm not really sure why they put the Indian on the sale of their land. I guess maybe it's supposed to look like they were selling the land. I don't get that. But so there were posters of this, and then there was a lot of, cattle rustling and horse stealing and things like that were going on in this aspect. Because if you look at it, between 1775 and 92, the land shrinkage of the homeland of the West was just dramatically changing. And so you had people within one generation who had never, who had barely known a horse, and now they knew of airplanes too, And this just shows a little bit, really not that quickly, but this was the traditional homeland of what would be the Blackfoot country. So if you see all the way up into Saskatchewan and Canada, Alberta, and presently, that's where I grew up. So then you have on the other side a map that kind of gives some of the sites. These are more locations related to the treaties and how much they ceded on the treaty in Canada right here. You can see the borderline. So we're talking about people who crossed easily 500 miles, to get someplace that they thought was important to go to for whatever reason, be it for reasons of trade. And this is just another kind of rough general area of what we're talking about and the Native people encountered there. And a depiction of sort of the government going after the land. The loss of the land was primarily... I don't think people necessarily associate it with the women's role that often, at least in the literature it doesn't appear to be. But this is a picture of ammonite, which is an archaeological paper that I looked up on what is known as the buffalo stone, or what we call iniskim, which is, they call it a charm, but it's really, when it breaks out of here, it takes this shape. And there's a whole place outside of Calgary, Alberta, known as Ammonite Beach by the archaeologists, because it has several of these. And there's stories that go with this about the women's role and the power. So in this time of treaty negotiations, and this is, for example, one of the translators and RCMP officers. So you have a lot of interaction already starting up where people are... delegations are gathering and people are doing presentations. And of course, the ceremonies, this was just one good example of the ways in which the Indian agent of the time and his child are present now at Sundance ceremonies. That's what that is. And so the overreaching, the 1890s, this ceremony was actually outlawed because it was assumed to have been part of the brave making rituals, which is what all these early writers had described it as, which is, of course, not what it is at all. But again, aside from not being that, it also didn't talk about what the women's role was. So, of course, not long after that, and kind of concurrent with all of this, is starting up this mission to begin to educate the Native children and to find ways and to sort of break some of these traditions that they have developed from their parents. And sort of the way to do that was to send them about as far away as you could possibly get. So there's been quite a bit of scholarship on this. So Cecil Denny was a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and he talks about, he and others have written quite extensively about that. So, in the 1890s, pretty much by the time the fur trade's really wrapping up, sort of poverty, starvation, reservation life is looking pretty dire. And these are not out of focus on purpose, but again, the Peabody, thank you very much. No, they are, my brother, who's a photographer, decided this was rather artistic. But this was the take on, how you have to deal with this. The interpreter LaRue, who I showed you in that previous picture, made this statement about it. When he's trying to tell people how to understand the Indian mind, he's pretty much saying, it's the mind of a child, not really anybody serious of any kind of consequence you need to worry about. So the project of civilizing should, if you take that approach and you treat them as if they were children, then you can get much further. And so these are just some examples of the children as they were being educated by several missionaries, some of whom are mentioned down here. Not going to get too much into it. McKay, Timms, anyone who's really studied it. There's pretty much Presbyterians, Anglicans, Roman Catholics, Methodists. There was just such a slew of religions with their dioceses in the areas in the effort to bring, this kind of civilized mind. So we're going to flash through that a little bit. Just to give you an idea. But so in essence, a part of the mission of these schools was to teach these women, these girls rather, the labor of how to bake bread, how to wash sheets, the boys how to take care of animals and milk the cows and do things like that. And often the arts were they were taught because I don't think these kids were becoming very literate. They still weren't really understanding English. So singing and the choir and all those things became a really important activity. And then, of course, the denominations were fighting over who would have these children. But here you can see the agencies. I mean, this is 1887, already just on the heels of some pretty bad starvation and massacres and stuff. So these are just giving you an idea of what these agencies look like and when the women really were going to these places and crawling through the windows there to try to get liver or a tongue or a hoof or whatever they could get. And this again is Fort Wiltup, a very famous fort. And here they wait for rations to be given out. These were the ones that were given or guaranteed rather by the treaties, as well as clothing. More wait for food, a little more modern, but still kind of the same idea. So, and then it just goes back to this idea that the traditions are getting really hard to teach because, in fact, they were outlawed. And I think some people don't really realize really what ends up happening with a tradition the minute it's outlawed is a lot of it went underground. And so for those who actually thought they're getting together to make braves or to worship the devil or whatever, that the fact that things had to go underground to continue sort of confirmed that for a lot of people. And say in a ceremony, it might be the normal thing to have a giveaway, or what we call a giveaway, where you're basically giving everyone who attends something to take home with them. One of the educators from back home, Leroy Littlebear, mentioned one time that, in those days, they, instead of, when he was growing up back in the 50s and in the 40s, they had instead of being able to give away a horse, because the government was very much against that, because they felt that, you're just going to go out and raid more horses from the local rancher, so quit that. So they would stand up in front of everybody and give these big, long speeches of thanks and appreciation, and they'd hand out sticks of gum and say, this stick of gum is for you, this one's for you, and everyone knew that those sticks of gum actually represented a horse, but they couldn't say, I give you a horse. So everybody had a happy stick of gum when they left, and the government, I guess, was none the wiser. But you end up having this sort of situation going on. The other thing that happened was the outlawing of burials in the trees. And here you see a couple. This is kind of the traditional way, is on a platform, and we'll get more into that as we go on. But the upshot is that the ground being so frozen, because this is a really cold climate and also no trees, as you can see, it's the plains, it's very rocky, the topsoil is very thin. But for spiritual, religious reasons, of course, this was not the ideal way to go. And also, what ended up happening here as well is the women who were traditionally in charge of things like birthing practices or burials, you can see in the photo here, they're showing, here's somebody who's visiting and maybe wailing, as they describe it, crying, praying, doing whatever. But all of a sudden, you're in a position where you're really taken out of that, because now you have to pay to have a coffin and then place it someplace with a church. So this idea of verifying and rejecting things that came from women if other people didn't confirm them was also practice, which kind of, again, isolated a little bit the voice. Now, this is despite the fact that when explorers, and just so happens both of these pictures were taken by Walter McClintock, who had gone out early on to help establish the national park. You're noticing people in ceremonial setting. In both cases, like here, he has a pipe, and so he's praying, so she's sitting there. He's holding his pipe. I mean, these are settings where, and this is another one where you have people conducting themselves in ceremonial settings where the women are obviously partner to what is happening. This couple's been involved in the North Pagan Canadian context for quite a while, and I've worked with their son, and they have a tradition of teaching others as well as those within their family. And, of course, that's as much with the woman as it is with the man. Here's just a couple other photos showing sort of the partnerships that happen. So these two are the men on this side, the women on this side, the mother, the grandmother. Same down here. This is part of a beaver ceremonial. By the way, for those of you who are wondering, I'm not putting any photos up here that are, number one, haven't already been published and that I've, in consultation, have determined might be problematic in terms of their ceremonial content. Also, not a very good picture here, but just to give you an idea, there are two couples here, and this is one of the guys, here's another elder, here's his wife, and this is the wife of this guy. But what I'm trying to show here is how, in essence, people would paint or depict the sort of spiritual relationship that men would have. And they'd say, well, the men do this, the men do that. And there was quite a lot of research, almost, you can look up Thomas Males, you can look up Harold. These people who've written on the Western culture of Native religion. And many times there's a lot of focus on the men's secret societies, on their dances, on their songs, and very little talked about with regard to the women. And you can see that there were several, and there are actually more in this series of pictures that were taken where she is in just as much ceremonial regalia, as you might say, as he is. She has her headdress. She's got pretty much everything going on, and he has his pipe, and so they're standing there posing for this picture. Now, they're partners in this, and in essence, when McClintock went to publish his research on this some years later, these are the kind of images that he highlighted, though. It's not to say that he was ignoring it, because obviously the old man taught him a lot. But you have to wonder, I was kind of wondering, where is she? So again, where is she? So I think that is what occurred to me over the time of researching this stuff. And again, to go back to the headdresses and the fact that whether you look at the art of Native America, whether you look at the history, there's, the idea that headdresses would be a male thing that men would have. Here you have some pictures of a couple, each with a headdress, which some authors have claimed, mostly a couple of museum curators have argued that this was a phenomenon that began after contact with whites, but it's also a tradition that's gone long into, goes way back. And this is part of a Sundance lodge where you have the main woman and her husband and the other attendant men. And I wanted you to see the women, how they're all ready, and they're kind of hiding their faces from the photographer, but their altar is empty, so they let him in to take pictures before they did anything. But it's just to go, she has her appropriate headdress, and here's some more images of women in their headdresses. And again, you can kind of get an idea. These are at Sundances, and again, these are women making their offering at the Sundance. Another headdress, another offering. This would be the Sundance women or other women who are attending. And in particular, this is her. This is a picture of one of the Sundance women in her headdress, which is in more detail here, and another one here. In the Blackfoot tradition, and I suspect in some of the others that I've read about in works like that of Catlin or other people, there are very specific roles for the women, but very little, again, was learned about them because of the access problems, language problems. McClintock, who actually was a Yale graduate, so all of his work is at the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscript collection up at Yale, ended up learning the language, and he spent quite a few years amongst the native people. So he got this kind of access that would pretty unprecedented, actually. So here's the procession that goes on, and there she is again, and these are the men. I'll tell you a little bit more about this later, but just to give you an idea of the way that women are as much involved, if not more so. And another way in which they are is in the what's called the Moto Geeks, the Buffalo Women's Society. And this is a picture of one wearing her headdress, and this is again a picture courtesy of the Peabody. Oops, sorry. So to go back to just this for 1 second. I'm sorry, it's my arm, I'm leaning on it. If you get dizzy, it's your fault. No. Okay. So, in other words, this is them dancing out during the actual ceremony of when we go on to have the Women's Buffalo Lodge, which is its own lodge. It's something entirely separate from what goes on at what is known popularly as the Sundance. And they each have their own individual headdresses. They're also in charge with their the travois that you see, which is this triangle that's used to carry and move things, constructing a lodge. Now this is really, really important because it looks like, well, they're putting up a lodge. In the old days, they used to use these to construct a round lodge, which is in the form of what is known as like a buffalo pound, or where the first foods were gathered by the hunters. They also work the hides from that, and yes, they do all the work as noted several times over. And it's really hard work. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to lift a teepee pole. Just one alone is, for me anyway, way too much. So I can't even imagine what these must have weighed when they were made out of actual hide as opposed to canvas. But there's several pictures where they're actually creating a teepee for their child, which is toy teepees. And in the sense that they used to say that children and play and fun and enjoyment was a way to teach thinking. Part of that was they're thinking about their lives as they're playing. In other words, they're thinking about how to be. And there's terms in Blackfoot for how to talk about that really you learn about life by your play. And you learn how to think about those things that you want to accomplish, those things that you want to become. And so the aspect of play that's provided for by a family who can afford to get their kid a toy that big was pretty amazing. And also, the care for the puppies. They had their appropriate little dog houses as well. So, and then the other, one of the things I wanted to point out here was at the bottom of these teepees, as you can see with the paint, there are these triangular shapes representing what are essentially these back here. So the mountains and the Rockies, like this is the not a great picture, but it's one that I liked because it lined up with the actual teepees, and this is supposed to sort of mimic the life of the mountain and the image of the mountains, and these are all depicted on here. This is going back to that idea that this is the homeland that made these designs. So yet another photo. Those things are massive. I don't know why I'm laughing. I couldn't set one up by myself if I had to. It's like not easy work. And again, over here you have a couple. They're both painting one, but you can see that women, these are different teepees altogether from totally different settings. But here she's fleshing the hide, and here they're painting them. So yes, the labor was there. Also, this is kind of like like a sewing club. I mean, they get together and all the friends and family pitch in to help a woman make her teepee. And this is a gathering like that. They're all sitting together. And of course, they got their kids there too, so the kids are learning how to do that too. More fleshing. And some of the designs. And I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly, but I just want to give you an idea of these are the teepee liners that go inside. There's more work. There's also these women doing parfleche, 2 different women, 2 different settings. But they're burning holes they got their little fire going, and they're burning holes in there. And of course, attended by young women who at this time are already in school or already learning the other ways, but their parents are showing these traditional things. And in these designs are they're basically painted to represent the experiences or those things that these women find important in their lives as well. So this is again true for the plains. Some of these are Sioux or Crow bags. Some of them are Blackfeet. Just to give you an idea, this is a Nez Perce woven bag, but the geometrical designs all have reference to, again, the analogy that they're making to the land base. And again, here we have some of these pictures that, like in this case, would be saddlebags. In this case, this is a cover for a mirror, pipe bags, and this is you have coverings for the awls and the tools. Like these are basically tools that women had and designed as well. But these designs are pretty significant in that there's if we went back to well, no, we'll see more and we can talk about it. But martingales for horses, for example, you see the geometric designs here, these inverted cones, the triangles. You also see them here, inverted cones and a middle. And usually they'll have like a sort of symmetrical design of some sort. And the martingale with the different flowers and the herbs that the women use. So same here, we have what are essentially designs based on sort of like what they've called a Celtic cross, but it's not really. It's like the circular is referring to the sun and the sunwise positions, and then in many cases the cycles really of life. And so as you can see here, there are usually 3 or 4 that they'll have built up into these bands that were either put on blankets or wrapped on the horses. And this design, which is essential, it has larger connections to the seasons and the changing of the, it's like sort of like stone wheels, medicine wheels that measure the same thing in the solstices. So this design is often seen on many work, but it's also many of these works. But it also refers to, if you stood it up, you have the physical aspect of the teepee and the crux point, and then this sort of part where the poles go, which is the spirit or the metaphysical or the non-material. So there's an acknowledgement always of sort of those two sides of everything, right here and right here. And this pictures of a bunch of Blackfeet chiefs, but I wanted you to see the ways in which these bands were used to wrap around. As well, the shirts and other things, there's a lot of stuff in this, which I don't have time for today, but which goes to the traditional stories as well, that tell you exactly why everything is where it is. And, but you start seeing designs that are emblematic, like the crosses are the representations of the stars, for instance. And then here we have our inverted cones again. And this is an actually much older style. And then on these are all the drudge work of the women, but in many cases are like many other indigenous peoples who would put their incorporated knowledge, in other words, of the very medicines that we're talking about in their herbology, into their art, so that they're wearing the plants that they know about. So these are not just sort of it's a random flower, but it has significance for the men too, as well as on their gloves. You can put specific medicines and flowers on there that are from the area that you know about. Again, the pipe bags have the same issue here. You can tell what that is. And then sometimes the squares were depictions of the sun or the moon or other things like that. So they were square because in this case you can see they're quilled, but we still have this same design motif, I guess we'd call it. But this symmetry between the physical and the metaphysical. Again, some designs that are kind of typical of Blackfeet. You could actually tell the tribal member often by how many, like for example, there's 3 main bands of the Blackfeet. So often the design motifs have 3 aspects to show you the unification of all of the bands. So this is just a couple pictures where women are actually sitting doing beadwork with their kids. Another thing that, in addition to the liners and the things worn and the packaged little things set up for the photo here, is you have these backrests that were an essential part of it. And if you can see really closely here, they have carving at the very end, which was also done by women. And again, it's kind of intricate in terms of the way that it's designed. So that all the way to the bags for everything, including the medicines that were used, the bundles, personal bundles, and these collections that belong to the tribe, which are really these bundles here. This is a beaver bundle right here, and this is a medicine pipe bundle. These are both societies of the Blackfeet that, or the Blackfoot, that other people also, they have their own bundles that are different. But these became really essentially the property, and the caretaking responsibility for these is on the women. Not so much the medicine pipe, but entirely, but for the women to lug this around, carry it, move it. It's their work. And so, of course, the horse. I kind of like this quote. I just put it up because I enjoyed it. But it speaks to the power of this misperception that's been promoted by a lot of the literature, that horses were really the domain of the men and the property of the men. And that really when horse raiding happened, it was to gain glory and fame and do things like that. Here, whether or not that's what their intent was, they were encouraged to sometimes fight on behalf of things that the women were not in agreement with, in part because they were like, whoa, where are you going? That's my horse. So anyway, so part of the designs, again, was to also show the beauty and the respect to decorating your horse. And again, you see she's got her ceremonial things on her horse. Here you see this is in the actual loading on of those bundles onto the travois, and special horses and special women would do that. And again, this is a woman attending to that, so this was again part of that honor, really, of taking care of that. You see just different examples. This is in the community aspect where you might be living in an encampment, but it's not really a ceremonial setting. And this is one I wanted to show you where it's actually like everyone's formally together, like a reunion, like a Sundance. And in the dead of winter, your best friend, the dog, in the old days he was doing the job. And in addition, kids were also lugged back there. So I'm sorry, I have to laugh. Every time I see this picture, I just love that expression. So this poor kid. But what I wanted to show you in here was the intricate work done on her dress, like all across the top of it. I mean, she's very young to have such a fancy little dress, but it's part of that respect for her role in bringing her up in the ceremonial thing. This is not an everyday outfit. And so again, these are some Sioux women and just kind of the way that the caretaking was done. But you can see with the children who were being raised to be part of the ceremonies that there is quite a bit of attention put to not just outfitting them properly, but outfitting them with the duties and the caretaking. Because in many cases, special headdresses, special outfits, like you see this guy right here. I mean, he's decked out. He actually has ceremonial duties that go along with that. So at that young age, I mean, he's pretty young. He's already been given the responsibility, say, to take care of a pipe or to take care of a headdress or to take care of things like that. And in other words, they're brought up into the thinking about how to do that. And that's the same for the women, too. Just some more examples. Again, some more artwork which shows very clearly these motifs of the crossing, because they have a lot of crosses that, again, were misunderstood, I think, by attempts to sort of get an understanding of their ideology or their notions of the sacred. Here again, you see the motif. This is the round, or the squares were actually carryovers from the days of the quills. Before you could actually make a round thing with beads, you represented the stars, the sun or the moon or whatever, with, in many cases, the sun with a square. And again, if you lay this on its side and see it differently, you're seeing the mountains yet again. So very typical of the Blackfeet. Right there's another picture of the same thing. And this triangle here, we'll get into more of that. Just some examples, hey? So you see the star, and really what they're saying here, right, is we're living in these realms between the sky and the earth. So that's where we live. And they're saying this is what we see. What do we see? We see blue skies and then this red-yellow thing over here we see the blue skies, and we see these stars or these shining things. And then when we look, we see that. And so these things are depicted on people during the ceremonies, out of respect for sort of the inclusion of that other part of the cone, which talks about the metaphysical or the spiritual aspects of who we are. And all of these things are in the caretaking, the well-being sort of the women. I mean, without the creation of this type of work, you know, it's ironic because to sort of misunderstand that women create this work and at the same time aren't purveyors and carriers and teachers of their most traditional belief systems is just impossible, actually. And there's no way that I think a lot of what's been developed in some of the research was sort of a way of thinking about Native peoples, that they do things in this sort of static practice of repeating tradition, but without necessarily involvement or application. And what's happening here is you've got people who've repeated traditions that have that are speaking to the biggest, highest, most important teachings of the religion. And in the case of the Sundance woman, for example, this woman who goes out and has to make a vow in order for her to be a part of that ceremony, to lead that ceremony, that ceremony is really speaking to the authority of not just her, but also the other women who are her helpers, the other women in that society. And that the Iniskim that I showed you, the little buffalo rock, the buffalo headdress, the enclosures that they're making, all of those are related to what's considered pretty much the basics of life, right? If you don't have sustenance and you don't have shelter, you don't live. So on the most plain and basic level, the responsibility of the woman to take care of food and shelter and to own food and shelter is really it's saying quite a bit, because it's sort of saying you can sustain yourself by your spiritual life, but the reality is too is that, you know, your body, to live here between the earth and the sky, you must have food and you must have shelter. So this, in essence, kind of, when you see the art that these women create, when you see their teepees, when you see the life that is in many cases still very much a part of the religious life of the Native woman, is that she's got on her that responsibility, that caretaking that she needs to do. Only it goes from not just the immediate family, but out to the entire community. The tribe basically looks to her to have that knowledge. She has to have it. So this was my little picture, as you know, that I submitted for the poster for this talk. But it's supposed to be a couple of the characters from the star stories that we have, a whole bunch of them, as do pretty much all these traditions. And then this is supposed to be one of our tricksters, and this is his rainbow and his clouds. And it's not a very good image, but it's from the Museum in New York of Natural History. And it's, as you can tell, reminiscent of another famous spiritual painting. But in this case, this is supposed to be, it really struck me when I saw this, because then again, this is that whole remaking of, if we continue to sort of remake our understandings kind of in light of what we already know from another way of thinking or another way of life, without kind of really getting into the nitty-gritty of what are the aspects of the ways in which women have a lot of pride about their work, I think we lose out. And I think there's a lot to be learned from actually going back and saying, well, okay, in what ways, you know, is the power to say, well, I own my own horse and I own, you know, all of this, became what scholars started kind of late, actually, because before that they were the RCMP. They were the fur traders and trappers and settlers who were doing a lot of the writing about this stuff. And so it ends up being a little bit skewed, and I think that in order to really understand in a better way and more clearly sort of the centrality of the female role within this, is to not so much convert her into a misinterpretation, but to look at it legitimately for what it really is. And I think part of, I guess, my blessing or my gift or my whatever that I've had is that I've had an opportunity to be a part of the ceremonies where I've had to learn a lot of that, because unfortunately it's not really in the scholarship. And so it's in part because of that I go, wow, you know, now I can see this contrasted with what I've been taught. And there's a lot to learn there, and I think it's a really wonderful message for possibilities. So thank you very much.